The best thing about the true crime subgenre is that it's based on real life events, real things that happened, which somehow makes it a little scarier than the fictional stuff that we see in other horror subgenres. The second best thing about it is how much of it's on Netflix. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all of the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out our introduction video. There's a link to that in the description below, and it'll give you a pretty good idea of what the Horror Movie Syllabus is all about. In short, we look at a particular subgenre of horror, and then we pick 3 movies from the subgenre to explore. And today's subgenre is true crime. And true crime is actually kind of almost a genre unto itself because it blurs the line between documentary and dramatic retelling, right? It can be fictionalized, it can be straight up documentary, it can be something in between docudrama. It really does have a broad scope or have its own like almost little mini subgenres within the subgenre itself. And really, it's kind of easy to understand why, because the true crime subgenre, or even if you wanted to call it its own genre, is really, really popular, at least here in America, and I think abroad as well. The popularity seems to have grown exponentially over the last several years. I don't know if it's because of the advent of streaming services like Netflix kind of filling our screens with documentaries about true crime killers, or if it's just something that appeals to our prurient interest, really. You know, we have this fascination with real life crime, especially real life serial killers. And I'm as guilty of this as anybody, by the way. There's, this fascination with serial killers that leads to things like serial killer trading cards, action figures, and movies, and I would be lying to you if I had said I didn't have any of those things. I am one of the people who gets really into this kind of stuff, and I think it's because of the reality of the situation. There's something about a true crime story that is just more unsettling, more disturbing than a fictionalized counterpart. Like, if you hear about the antics of Hannibal Lecter, it's not nearly as scary as hearing about the antics of like Ted Bundy or Richard Ramirez. The fact the real people who did this are real and that this happened to actual people, actual victims, gives it a fascination and an allure that is frankly undeniable. And I know it's not for everybody. I know that there's a lot of people that probably are put off by the reality of it or feel like it's exploitative or kind of maybe a little disrespectful. And I think those are valid feelings to have. But it would be a flat out lie to deny the appeal of the true crime story, whether it be just crimes or serial killers or one-off killing or mass killings or whatever the case may be. We have a fascination with this. The news kind of feeds into this as well because of the coverage that these kinds of tragedies get. It's just something that is, it sparks the curiosity. It tickles the imagination. It scratches that mystery solving itch that a lot of us have. So I just kind of lean into it. I just accept that I like this stuff and that I'm really intrigued by it, and I'm not alone. Like I said, wildly popular, a very, very robust subgenre, and one that definitely merits some discussion here on the syllabus. That said, when I decided to include it in the syllabus, I had to decide for myself what exactly was going to be the scope of the true crime subgenre as it relates to the syllabus, and I decided that it's not going to include regular documentaries. We're going to discuss that at another date and time. Stay tuned for that. But for now, what I wanted to focus on is more like the dramatizations, the fictionalized accounts of true crime killers, cases, etc., because I felt like that is a very rich area that has plenty of great movies to talk about, and it's just plenty to whet my appetite and probably yours as well. So that's our focus: dramatizations, fictionalized versions, or even maybe like just barely fictionalized versions, mostly true versions of real life cases, real life killers. That's going to be the sweet spot for the true crime subgenre today. As usual, we're going to go ahead and rank them undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate level. And in this case, I think we'll rank them in ascending order of how dark or disturbing they are, or how dark and disturbing the cases they're based on are. And I think that this might be honestly splitting hairs a bit because I think that there's a lot of really intense and disturbing stuff we're going to talk about today. So fair warning up front. But I do think that I can make a pretty good case for why I personally feel these get increasingly more disturbing. But we'll get to all that in just a few minutes. For now, let's go ahead and just dig into these true crime stories. The first true crime movie that we're looking at today, the undergraduate level selection, is Zodiac. Zodiac came out in 2007 and is directed by the amazing David Fincher. And it is a real masterpiece of a work for him. Maybe not his best movie, but probably one of his best, with an all star cast and an amazing attention to detail that we're going to dig into a little bit more closely as we discuss the movie. But really is a movie that is a better movie than its reputation would have, in the sense of how much love it seems to get. It feels like people don't talk about this as much as they should be, at least not in the horror community. And I'm hoping to rectify that a little bit by shining a light on it here. If you haven't seen the movie before, the story is about two newspaper guys and a cop in San Francisco in the late 60s, early 70s, who are investigating the Zodiac killer, a serial killer who was terrorizing the Bay Area and leaving these cryptic coded messages for them to try to decipher, meanwhile just killing random people, or at least seemingly random people, and basically putting the community and the country at large into a kind of a panic while they couldn't figure out who he was. And a spoiler alert for people who aren't familiar with the story, they never did figure out who he was, which is probably the most interesting thing about this movie being made. We'll stop there so as to not spoil it any more than that. But suffice to say, this movie is just incredibly well made. Like I said, it's directed by David Fincher, and if you're familiar with Fincher's work, you know the aesthetic that he brings. You know the loving detail he brings to like every shot, basically. And Zodiac is really displaying his talents quite a bit. This movie really feels like it was shot at the time that it was shot, not in terms of the filming aspect of it, like it's not shot like a 70s film, but it looks like it's filming the 70s. It looked like he took a modern day camera to the 1970s via a time machine and shot there. That's how good it looks. And the acting of the three leads, which are Robert Downey Jr., Jake Gyllenhaal, and Mark Ruffalo, is just perfect for this movie, because you've got these amazing A-list stars who are just working off of each other so well and blending together so well to make for a story that feels very believable. At some point, you kind of stop and forget that they are these famous stars, and you start to just buy into the performances, which is what a great actor can do. But I think it's all part of this collage of really wonderful things: direction, music, story, acting, that are all coming together to create an atmosphere that is just wonderfully tense and chilling. I'm not going to lie, Zodiac is one of the lesser horror films that we're going to talk about here, in the sense that it's not super scary for the most part. It feels mostly like a drama with some scenes of horror sprinkled in, mostly the reenactments of the Zodiac crimes, which are really pretty terrifying, especially because, again, they really happened, and they're portrayed pretty true to life. In the intro, I was talking a little bit about how these movies are dramatizations of real life events, not documentaries, but Zodiac pays a lot of attention to detail. They are very good in this movie about making the details feel or be very real, portraying it very close to the reality of what actually happened, which adds a layer to this movie of just disturbingness that is wonderful. The reenactments of the crime scenes are definitely chilling, but there are other things about this movie that just kind of add that atmosphere of dread and the feeling that the community would have had at this time. Now, this is before my time, and I wasn't there, but you can kind of feel how the community would feel, how people would be scared. It really comes through in the direction, in the writing, in the performances. It's just really well done. Fincher is just a master at creating mood, and he does it great here. The basement scene with Jake Gyllenhaal towards the end of the movie is absolutely fantastic. A master class in suspense and tension that is, it should be taught, and I think it might actually be taught. It's just so well done, and such a that scene alone to me makes this a horror movie, to be honest with you. But I love how attentive to detail this story is. I love how true to life it is. I love the performances, and I love that they picked this case because, like I said, it's an unsolved case. Perhaps one of the most famous, second to Jack the Ripper in terms of unsolved cases. But that makes for a hard movie because you're not really gonna get the most satisfying of endings because there's not gonna be a reveal. They're not gonna catch the killer at the end. I'm spoiling things if you don't know anything about the Zodiac, but I mean, it's a super famous case. It's like, again, second to Jack the Ripper. So yeah, there's not a true resolution in that sense, but I think that the ending that they did come up with for the movie is really, really good. I really love the way it ends, and if you know a little bit about that case, which I do, they did a pretty good job of coming up with, I'll call it loosely a resolution that I think works rather well and that the facts support. So I really like what they did there. I like the use of the newspapermen, especially the cartoonist played by Jake Gyllenhaal, as the protagonist because they are real life people. They are based on real life people with those names, and they're kind of the heroes in the movie. And I think that's a neat take. It's not just the cop, but it's these other people who were involved in trying to help solve the mystery. They get a light shined on them, and it's wonderful. It's really, really great. Again, this verisimilitude, these real life facts, these real life people just add so much to the movie and make it a really wonderful experience to kind of see, again, technically a fictionalized version, but a pretty true to life fictionalized version, and makes it feel so real and it gives it that extra oomph. Seeing these events in a fictional movie probably wouldn't hit as hard as it does in this movie, and that's what makes it true crime, and that's what makes true crime so great. Now, I'm going to backtrack on this in a little bit here, and kind of contradict myself, but for now, I'm going to say that the very accurate portrayal of Zodiac is a big part of what makes it great. David Fincher is probably the number one reason. The performances of the actors, the script is really, really great. It's a little long, but it never feels overstuffed or overstays its welcome. It's just a wonderfully well-made movie that, like I said, doesn't seem like it's gotten the love that it should. I mean, it got some critical praise when it came out, but it never really seems to make people's lists of major true crime works and stuff like that. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong on that, but when I was doing the research on this, I didn't feel like it got as much praise as it deserved. Now, clearly, I'm really into this movie, so I'm obviously a little biased on this point. But let me know in the comments if you think otherwise. If you feel like this movie is getting more praise and I just wasn't picking up on it, or I just feel like I'm being a little bit over sensitive to it not being considered a true crime classic or anything like that. But I do think that it warrants that kind of love. I do think it kind of warrants that reputation. So obviously, if you haven't seen it, I'd highly, highly recommend it. And if you have seen it, let me know what you think in the comments below. Am I overselling it? But I don't think I am. But we can have a civil conversation about that in the comments below. The next true crime movie we're talking about today, the graduate level selection, is Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer came out in 1986 and is a somewhat notorious and really well appreciated or well liked cult film, if you will. Wasn't exactly a huge hit when it came out. And when we talk about it, you'll kind of be able to understand why. But it really seems to have done very well subsequent to its release in terms of building up a reputation. And it's a very well deserved one. The movie is a hard watch, but it's one that kind of needs to be seen because it's just so well made and feels so gritty and real and shines this light on maybe one of the lesser known or lesser famous serial killers. But does it really shine an accurate light? Well, we're going to get into that in just a couple minutes here. But first, if you haven't seen it before, the movie stars Michael Rooker as Henry Lee Lucas, a serial killer who is considered to be wildly prolific, but also maybe just a wild exaggerator. But the movie itself details these crimes as if they are real, and his relationship with his partner in crime, Otis Toole, and the killing spree that they go on. It's basically a movie about their killing spree and a little bit about Otis's home life, and that's really all there is to it. But honestly, that's pretty much enough. I won't go into it any farther so as to not spoil the movie for you, although, again, plot-wise, there's not a tremendous amount to spoil. It's just a chunk of the killing career of Henry Lee Lucas. But it's really the specifics that are what hit home. And the specifics start with Michael Rooker. Michael Rooker's making his debut here, and he became much more famous mainstream for The Walking Dead and Guardians of the Galaxy and lots of other works. But he got his start here, and he gives an amazingly chilling performance. Now, from what I understand, a large part of it has to do with it. He went a bit method with this and really, really dove into this role, and he crushes it. he nails it. I would dare say Michael Rooker might be scarier than the real Henry Lee Lucas. He gives this performance that just with a look, he can be absolutely terrifying. And if you've seen him in other works, you know he has this ability, but he also has an ability to be really charming. The charm here is dialed down and the menace is dialed up, and it's very, very effective. The other thing that's really effective in this movie is how it's shot. It's a low budget movie. It's obviously not a mainstream topic, and it's not really a mainstream marketed movie. And so they shot it with this like low grade 16 millimeter film that just adds to the realism a little bit. It gives it almost a documentary feel. Like the film grain and everything like that just makes it feel literally gritty and just a little bit more realistic. And then the movie's barely pulling any punches. When it's showing you their crimes and the way that they assault people and murder people, the way they humiliate people, and the way they frankly get off on doing these things, both Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, it's really disturbing. Again, because it feels real. It feels gritty and honest and just authentic, and it just leaves you with this dirty feeling like you want to have a shower afterwards. The stuff that they're broaching here, especially in terms of like sexual assault and things like that, and some incest themes and things like that, are just really uncomfortable, to say the least. I'm probably underselling it, but it's a big part of why this movie has the reputation that it has. People know this movie as being an uncomfortable watch, as being a bit of a tough one. In fact, a lot of people are probably surprised that this isn't my selection for the postgraduate level, considering that I'm kind of grading on this escalating curve of how dark and disturbing they are. This is a very dark, very disturbing movie. Buckle up for the next one, I suppose. But a better personal preference, I do think that this movie could have gone even farther with some of the grotesque and disturbing and awful things that could have been portrayed. However, it's interesting to see what they did choose, because famously Henry Lee Lucas confessed to like hundreds of killings. He was convicted for 11, and there's a lot of evidence to denote that he might have been lying about a lot of these confessed killings. And cops would come and try to close their cases by getting him to confess, and he would, just to, I think, get attention. I don't know, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he has grossly exaggerated what he's done. So this movie kind of threads the middle ground. It doesn't really like show the whole breadth of what he claims to have done, but it doesn't also just stick to the facts of what he actually is known to have done. It kind of goes in the middle, and this is very much based on real people, but it is taking some big liberties with the narrative in terms of being true to the facts. Like the way Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole meet in the movie is not the same way it happened in real life. Their backstory is not the same. And the whole thing with Otis's sister in the movie, I guess in reality, it was actually like his niece, and she's much younger in real life. So it's much worse in real life, the stuff that happens in the movie. So they're not really completely going as hardcore as they could have, and they don't need to. The movie's hardcore enough. It's not for everybody. Let me just put it out there, but it is a really, really good movie. It's very well made. That gritty realism, the low grade film really adds something to it, and it's really Michael Rooker. He just is absolutely fantastic in this movie. And side note, I actually got a chance to meet Michael Rooker at a convention. He was literally walking to a signing, and I just kind of bumped into him, and he let me walk with him for a few minutes. And I think the reason he did is because I was like probably the only person who didn't ask him about Walking Dead, which Walking Dead was really big at the time. I asked about Henry. I wanted to talk to him about Henry, and he was more than happy to chat with me about the challenges of doing that movie and the kind of going the places he had to go to deliver that performance. Wonderful conversation for about 4 or 5 minutes. Really nice man, and it was a really cool conversation. But I really remember him talking about how much he put into that performance, and it shows. It's there on the screen. It's a masterful performance that will chill you to the bone, frankly, because again, it's based on reality. This was a real person. While the facts may be changed up a little bit for story convenience and whatnot, this is a real person who was really sick, who did really sick things, and that's really disturbing. And the movie, as a result, is very, very disturbing too. Again, not for everybody. So maybe do a little research on it if you decide you want to try to check it out. But if you have seen it, let me know what you think. Like I said, this movie has a lot of fans. It's got a pretty good cult following, and really is pretty well known amongst horror fans. It's pretty notorious. I absolutely love it. I think it's a fantastic movie, but it's admittedly not one that I go to a lot because, again, it's an uncomfortable watch. It's kind of gross, makes you feel dirty. So be forewarned, but I do recommend it if you haven't seen it. And the last true crime story we're talking about today, the postgraduate level selection, is The Girl Next Door. The Girl Next Door came out in 2007 and is pretty hardcore in terms of its subject matter, in terms of the case that they're talking about. This is a really dark, depressing, and disgusting story that frankly probably needs a lot more attention because I don't think people are as familiar with it. It's definitely not as mainstream as a lot of the other movies that we're going to talk about today. And it doesn't have the same reputation, probably because it's not really a serial killer, but it's still the details of it are just so shocking and so upsetting that I'm surprised it doesn't have a higher profile than it already does. If you haven't seen it before, the movie tells the story about Sylvia Likens, a young girl, and her little sister whose parents had to go away for a while and decided to leave her into the care of a neighbor. And they would pay the neighbor to basically babysit her, take care of her while they were away. Only this woman wound up starting to torture the children along with her children, and the neighborhood kids who would abuse and torment and torture and assault these young girls, especially Sylvia, until she eventually died from all of this abuse. And we'll go ahead and just leave it there and not go into the details too much more, partly not to spoil and partly not to disturb everybody, because it's pretty dark, but we are going to brush up on some of the specifics, so be forewarned. The movie is another tough watch, like Henry, but for different reasons. And the reasons are because the specifics of this abuse, of this torment, of this torture are so heinous and so awful that they're just going to make you cringe. Now, it's worth noting up front that this movie is based on a 1986 novel by Jack Ketchum, famous writer, and his book, and by extension the movie, are based on or really kind of more inspired by the Sylvia Likens story, but they don't use those names, and it's not a factual recreation. It really is a story, a dramatization, a fictional story that is inspired by and based on this case. But the stuff that's in it is pretty true to the horrific stuff that actually happened. Like the things that you would think are fake in the movie, made up for the sake of horror or shock or whatever, those are the real things. Those are the things that are true. The stuff that happens to the girl in the movie, again, they don't use her name Sylvia, they call her something else. Those are the things that are closer in reality to what actually happened in the real life. So that's this may be one of the more farthest from reality or farthest from fact of the true crime movies we're talking about. But there's a reason why I did that, and it's this. There is another movie called An American Crime, which I think was made the same year, 2007, but I think it might have gotten pushed a little bit longer because of the similarity. And American Crime, which stars Elliot Page and Catherine Keener, is very much more truth based. It's very much the real story with Sylvia Likens, with the real names, but it focuses more on the court case and a little bit more of the drama. And while it does show some of the torment and it kind of talks about it, and it's still a tough watch and still a good movie, it doesn't. To me, it pulls the punches a lot more than The Girl Next Door. Partly because it was, I think, made for TV, but partly because I think they was just, they didn't want to focus on that. They wanted to focus more on the story and the aftermath of the case rather than the horrific events. Whereas The Girl Next Door really does stay focused on those actual events, the actual torment, the actual crime. And that to me makes it more hardcore. It makes it more disturbing than Henry to me because your victims are children, and they're being molested and tormented and tortured, the branded, violated, mental abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. It's awful stuff, and it just hits really hard when you realize that both movies do not depict as bad as it actually got in real life. And that just kills me. If you read the real life story about what happened, the real details, it's actually worse than either of the movies. And again, like American Crime shows some shockingly bad stuff, but just a little bit. And then Girl Next Door shows some really shockingly bad stuff. Their stuff on screen is pretty shocking, and yet still not as bad as what actually happened to Sylvia Likens. And that's a big part of why I wanted to highlight this on the syllabus. I think it's a good movie. I think that all the people acting in it are doing a really good job. I think it's a good paced movie that, again, doesn't pull its punches very much. It really kind of shows what's happening and really just leaves you with a gross feeling afterwards. But I also feel like this is a case that just isn't well known. Again, the woman who's doing these acts is not really, she wasn't a serial killer. She didn't have like the cachet of like a John Wayne Gacy or a Charles Manson or whatever. And so I don't think it has the same, appeal. Titillation, if you will. And also because it's just wildly uncomfortable. But I do think it's an important story that it should be known and should be told because it almost seems unbelievable. When you see this movie, you will think that it's not believable, but it is. In fact, it's worse than what you think it is. And so, not only would I recommend trying to watch this if you can take it, and if you're a sensitive person, look up what's in it beforehand because maybe you can't. But for anybody who can handle it, I'd say you should definitely see this movie and do a little bit of research. At least check out Wikipedia, just see the real case and see just what happened to this poor girl because I feel like she deserves to be seen. To have that light shined on her, and to have her the crimes against her be not be forgotten because it's a shocking event that doesn't seem to be as well known and it's something that I don't feel like people should forget about. So I put this one as my postgraduate because it makes me extremely uncomfortable, and it will probably make you extremely uncomfortable as well. But I bet some of you have seen it. Would like to hear your thoughts on it. But this is what I guess I'm not really recommending so much as it's almost like a more like homework than like an enjoyable experience. I don't think you're gonna have fun watching this movie, but I think it's important to know about it. So if nothing else, maybe do a little reading up on it and just kind of educate yourself about the case because it's a pretty noteworthy one and a pretty interesting one, but also a pretty tough one to swallow. So that's going to do it for our exploration into the true crime subgenre. But as usual, I've got some extra credit movies for you to check out, and there were a lot to choose from. So I picked three that I thought were kind of interesting or important, and I'm going to explain to you why. The first one that I want to talk to you about is called Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile, which is a mouthful of a movie. Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile came out in 2019, so it's a fairly recent movie, and it stars Zac Efron as famous serial killer Ted Bundy. And it's really a fascinating take on the Ted Bundy mythos because it's focused on him, but also not focused on him. And that's part of why I want to talk about it because I think that the approach they took to make this movie is really, really interesting. If you haven't seen it before, the movie is the story about Ted Bundy getting caught and defending himself. And it's told from the point of view of his girlfriend, Liz Kendall. And it's based on the book that she wrote about living with Bundy and being part of how he got caught by turning him in. And it has the focus of seeing things largely from her eyes, not exclusively from her eyes, but largely from her eyes, from her perspective. And that is a fresh perspective to take. Instead of trying to view from the serial killer or from the victim of the serial killer, it's going with the girlfriend of the serial killer who was largely unaware of what was going on for a large part of the time. And that's fascinating to me. Now, because of the source material, because of this perspective, it's being pretty true to the facts for the most part. There's only the most minor of details that are changed. For the most part, this is a very true to life, true to the facts story. And it's really, really good, in my opinion. Not everybody shares that opinion. It's got some mixed reviews, but most people seem to agree that Zac Efron is doing a great job as Ted Bundy. And that's no mistake. People 'cause some people I guess complained that maybe casting him with his experience with Disney and stuff like that was kind of some sort of exploitation move or something like that. But listening to the director talk about it, he really explains that that's kind of by design. He wanted to put somebody in there who could do no wrong, somebody who was kind of beloved, and because that's kind of how Ted Bundy came off. He was so likable and so, appealing that people didn't want to believe bad things about him. So putting Zac Efron there is very effective. I'm not super familiar with Zac Efron's work, but I can easily say this is the best I've seen him do. His best performance. He's absolutely riveting as Ted Bundy. But everybody in the movie is doing really, really good work. Now, one thing I will say in terms of a criticizing the movie is that the girlfriend Liz Kendall does get lost a little bit in the story as the focus shifts a little bit more into Bundy, which let's be honest, that's what the audience wants. Again, that whole appeal of serial killers that I talked about earlier is kind of part of this movie, but The director does a really good job of trying to not glamorize Bundy, and I think he succeeds. I think he does a good job of showing Bundy to be what he is, which is a very flawed and deeply disturbing individual. He avoids the idea of just trying to make him into a pure monster because it's not really the most accurate portrayal, but he also doesn't want to make him to be so likable that you're rooting for him because you see what he leaves in his wake. And that's the thing I like with this movie the most is that perspective of seeing him as the family man, seeing him from the perspective of somebody who loved him and then had to be confronted with these crimes and had to deal with that. That's an interesting angle, and I like that. There's a lot of stuff out there about Bundy, both books and movies. There's a lot of stuff telling his story. There's a lot of stuff that's loosely based on him. There's a lot of stuff that's inspired by his crimes. This movie and the book really do focus on a cool aspect that was fresh and original and gave it something more, something different, something to set it apart from so much of the other Bundy stuff out there. And that's the main reason why I wanted to shine a light on it. Again, it's really well made. I like how well directed it is. I love the performance by Zac Efron, and I love the approach. I love the approach of taking this book by his ex-girlfriend and focusing on that angle rather than just a straight retelling of his career in killing. It's a wonderful example of how to do a true crime story kind of respectfully, but not diminish the gruesomeness and terribleness of the crimes. Again, another one of these ones where it's not quite as scary or horrific in the sense that they're not showing a tremendous amount of the violence. Very, very, very little of that. It's really more of a drama, but because of how chilling Ted Bundy is and how chilling the performance is by Zac Efron, I'm gonna happily call it horror movie and recommend it to you guys here. If you haven't seen it, check it out. The next extra credit movie I want to talk about is a movie called My Friend Dahmer. My Friend Dahmer came out in 2017 and is based on a graphic novel of the same name by a guy named John Durf Backderf, who is a childhood friend of Jeffrey Dahmer, famous cannibal serial killer. And he did this book that was based on real life experiences, and they made it into this movie. And both the book and the movie are absolutely positively fascinating. But if you haven't seen it before, the story focuses on a teenage Jeffrey Dahmer in high school and how awkward and off putting he is because he's dealing with some of these internal issues and interests of his sexuality and his propensity for death and fascination with it. And the connections he's making with these other high school kids, including Durf Backderf, that's his nickname, Durf, and their recollections of him and how he would interact with them and how he started to lose grip of normalcy and really kind of just fall into what would become a very tragic and unfortunate career of killing people that ends in tremendous tragedy. I won't go into anything more than that so as to not spoil it, but I would recommend this movie and the graphic novel. The writer Durf Backderf is a cartoonist, and he decided to put this together as a graphic novel, which is an odd choice, especially because his artwork is very cartoonish. It's not super dark, and it works. It works really, really well to tell this story that is creepy and macabre, but also just very honest. And the movie reflects this very well. They've done a really good job of making this story uh, tell a kind of stark and frank portrayal of of Dahmer without trying to glamorize him or sidestep his issues, but without also trying to make him into a monster and something inaccessible. It's just telling the true story of what he was like growing up, what he was like in high school, from this guy's perspective who knew him somewhat well. It's really fascinating. Once again, we're not seeing a lot of actual horror on screen, but the director does a really nice job of creating some very, very tense moments. In order to do that, he takes some liberties with the facts because the book itself is very factually based. It's a first hand account of Jeff Dahmer from a friend of his in high school. The movie takes some liberties with it, but the liberties are pretty minor, just like changing which characters have which conversations and stuff like that. But it adds some serious drama and tension to the movie that I think is very welcome and gives it a creep factor that's wonderful. The performances across the board are very good. The guy playing Dahmer is really, really good because he nails this awkward kid that you kind of feel sorry for, but you're also kind of put off by. Like on the one hand, you feel bad for him. On the other hand, you just don't really want anything to do with him. He kind of rides that line very, very well. And Alex Wolff from Hereditary is the guy playing Durf, and you can kind of see how he very honestly portrays how he was not the best of friend really to Dahmer. He was kind of an exploitative friend who kind of had fun, like having Dahmer be weird and goofy and stuff like that. It's a really interesting take, and you can kind of see how Dahmer really struggles to deal with this stuff. It also does have an insight into his struggle with his homosexuality, which is fascinating stuff, and it does kind of make him a little sympathetic, but it also again makes you not connect to him because he's got these weird interests in death and roadkill and stuff like that and experimenting on things that really makes him inaccessible. So it really rides that line very well. It's also just a really well made movie. It's a little bit of a slow burn movie, and it doesn't really pay off in anything shocking or violent. It ends with Dahmer finding his first victim. You don't see any of the killings that he would become famous for. And I think that's the wise choice. Again, it's kind of more of a drama, but it really told the right story. And once again, kind of like extremely wicked, shockingly violent, evil. It did show an interesting angle. A childhood friend of a serial killer. You don't see that very often. You just don't see somebody telling that detailed of a story and telling it that well. So it's a fresh take again that I really, really appreciate. And you'll see it kind of a theme with these extra credit selections that I was really focusing on true crime stories that had a fresh perspective or something that was a little different from the myriad other ones that are out there. And this one feels very unique because of that perspective, because of its subject matter or source material of the graphic novel. Really, really clever, really, really fascinating, really, really moving. This is what I would definitely recommend for pretty much anybody. If you're familiar with Jeffrey Dahmer or if you're not familiar with Jeffrey Dahmer, this is something to see. It's just a really good movie, and it's a really great introduction into this complex person who, unfortunately, like when he got caught, he was very willing to work with like doctors and stuff like that to be studied and examined, and try to help explain why he was the way he was. And then, of course, he wound up getting killed in prison, and it's a little unfortunate in the sense that he would have been a very valuable resource in terms of trying to learn more about what makes these kind of people tick. And so you see a little bit of that here. And so I don't know, it's a fascinating movie, and I have lots of other thoughts on it, but I don't want to go on too long about it. We can talk more about it in the comments below if you've seen it. And if you haven't seen it, definitely check it out, and then we will talk about it. The last extra credit movie I'm going to mention is a movie called Helter Skelter. Helter Skelter came out in 1976. It was a two-part TV miniseries that was based on a book of the same name by a man named Vincent Bugliosi, who was the prosecutor in the Charles Manson case. And so he has a really great perspective on the facts of this case, and it makes for a very interesting read and a pretty interesting movie, but we're going to get into all that in just a second. If you haven't seen it before, it is the story of Charles Manson and the Manson family murders of Sharon Tate and her friends and Rosemary and Lito LaBianca. And it really focuses on the court case, the investigation in the court case against Charles Manson and his family. And it really is focused on those details. And it's very, very true to the actual facts of the case because, again, it's coming from the prosecutor and has the advantage of the prosecutor's very good access to the facts, the evidence, the witnesses, everything. So the facts and everything are super tight in this movie. Now, the movie itself, because of this, is a little dry in some parts. It can be a little, it's hard to say because it's the 1970s, right? So there's already a little bit of a dated filmmaking style there that might not jive with some people. And it's so concerned about giving you all the facts, all the details, and there's a lot of them, that it sometimes sacrifices a little bit of the drama as a result. But when it comes through with the drama stuff, it comes through pretty hardcore. It comes through pretty great. The Manson family murders have been done ad nauseum. There's so much out there for it, but this is the best source in terms of the book for the true facts. The book is absolutely incredible. I've read it and it's fantastic. And if you want to know about Manson, this is the book to read more than anything else. This book is the book to read. The movie, unfortunately, like I said, is so focused on trying to like relate these facts to you that it's not as much fun to watch, for lack of a better way of putting it. But the guy playing Manson is great. Some of the other performances of some of the other Manson family people are great. But they're really kind of trying to lionize the prosecutor for obvious reasons. It's not the best work, but it is one of the most notorious works because Charles Manson, the most notorious of the serial killers, arguably, and Helter Skelter, probably one of the most famous of the you know of the titles or whatever of a movie, because it's based on a Beatles song. It was a rallying cry for Manson. This is all explained in the movie, and it's just so well known that I felt like I had to mention it. And again, another fresh take from the prosecutor's perspective. Very, very true. Great access to all the facts, just a great perspective, if admittedly a biased perspective, but a really, really informed perspective that you get from the prosecutor. There was, I guess, a 2004 TV remake of this, which I haven't seen, and nothing has told me that I really need to see it, so I haven't checked that one out. But the original one, like I said, it's more of a curiosity than anything. If anything, I would tell you to read the book rather than watch the movie. But the movie has its merits. It has its moments. It's a little long. It's like 3.5 hours total when you put both parts together. So it drags a bit in times. It's a little bit dry. And like I said, I think the book gives you a lot more meat on the bone. So I definitely recommend the book. Kind of a lukewarm recommendation for the movie, but I had to talk about it because it's just so well known as a true crime story. So that's going to do it for true crime. Like I said, there's a lot of material out there to choose from. There's a lot of good stuff out there. And if you're like me and you like this stuff, you're in luck because there's so much out there for you to consume. But these are some of the ones that I felt needed to be discussed, needed to be brought up. If you're not aware of these and you like true crime, you need to get on these for sure. You won't be disappointed. And if you're a true crime newbie, this is a great place to start because a lot of these are going to cover some of the basics for you, some of the more important and well-known stuff, and then some of the lesser-known gems like Sylvia Likens. So definitely check these out if you're into the true crime stuff or if you want to get into the true crime stuff. And now we're going to get into a horror trivia pursuit card, and I'm going to try to answer on camera a question without cutting, so you know if I told the truth and I actually got it right. And let's look at the killer category on the card because, we're talking about killers. So, okay, here's the question. In 1973's Theater of Blood, Edward Lionheart recites passages by what playwright? I have no idea. I don't think I've even seen Theater of Blood. It doesn't ring a bell. Maybe I've seen it and I just don't remember the title. I don't know, but it's not off the top of my head. It's not something that I know exactly what it is. So I really am going to wind up guessing here. I have no clue. It's asking for a playwright. So my immediate thoughts are kind of obvious, but we're going to hold up for just a second so I can give you guys a chance to think. But, I'm assuming if you've seen this movie, then you probably have a better shot than I do of knowing what this is, like without like actual knowledge of it instead of just a straight up guess. But I'm going to make a guess. And it's funny. We've been on a streak of really good questions where I've known the answer or I've done rather well. And this one is just so out of left field in terms of like, I don't know anything about this. I don't know that character. I don't know the name of that movie. I don't know anything about this. That said, I was an English major in college. And so I've read me some plays and stuff like that. And there are a few famous ones that we can go with. And so I have an obvious guess that I want to make, but then I'm also thinking, is that just too obvious? Is that just too obvious? Should I guess something a little less obscure because maybe that would make a little bit more sense? But then I start thinking about a lot of the times when I was having a string of bad luck with these questions and a lot of the bad guesses I was making, or really not even bad guesses so much as I just talked myself out of the right answer. So I've decided I'd start going with my gut. So I think I'm just going to go with my gut on this. And so hopefully you've had some time to think of your answer. I've got my answer, so lock yours in. My guess is going to be Shakespeare. Shakespeare is just the most famous playwright, the most obvious thing. And, it would be kind of a trite and obvious thing for a horror movie or any movie to use Shakespeare because it's just so blatant and simplistic in terms of a choice. And there's so many other ones you could go with. And I was actually thinking of a couple other ones. But like that was the first thought that popped in my head was Shakespeare. So I'm going to stick with Shakespeare, even though it's a pure guess. But lock your answers in. So let's see what the card says. William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare. I want to like brag about guessing that one right, but it's such an obvious answer that I don't feel even that good about guessing it, because I feel good that I did not listen to my instincts and try to second guess myself. I'm glad about that. I feel proud of that. But, you know, okay, so yeah, it's a movie that references Shakespeare. I mean, lots of movies do that. So okay, whatever. Yeah, knowing that doesn't make me think I remember this movie at all. But or if you've seen it, remind me in the comments about what it's about or something like that. Maybe let me know what it. Maybe I have seen it. And I'm just not thinking of it, but I don't think I've seen it. But let me know in the comments. Let me know in the comments if you got this answer right, or if you guessed something wrong and it was kind of funny. I'd love to hear wrong answers. You know me. Thanks very much for hanging out. I hope you enjoyed this true crime video. I hope you enjoyed true crime, because I do. And I hope we can keep the conversation going down in the comments below, because I've been on a big true crime kick lately. Been listening to the Red Handed podcast, which, by the way, highly recommend if you haven't checked that out. Red Handed, the podcast. But I love talking some true crime stuff. I've been really into it lately. So if you want to talk some true crime down in the comments below, let's do it. And then until next week, when we're talking about something else, class dismissed.